Hello, welcome to the discussion on murder and the commandment, thou shalt not murder, or to give it its positive affirmation, respect life. I'm going to give a short summary of my thoughts, and these are based on some notes I took during a study last summer, and then a short discussion that I'll follow that. So I'll proceed straight to the notes. There may be a correct way to live and wrong ways to live, just as there are times when it may be right to kill and other times when it will be wrong. It's important how we discern what is right and what is wrong. Where does our moral ethic come from? Are we able to discern and know this? In terms of something like murder, it seems quite an obvious thing. In a recent poll, over 97% in America, I think it was, agreed with this commandment. It left me a bit confused as to why 3% didn't. But I don't think it means they support murder. I think it meant that they felt the commandment perhaps was too simple and didn't provide enough meaning, and it didn't explain far enough what it meant by that. So it may seem obvious in some situations. Some things are very clear. Sometimes deliberately taking the life of a person there's obviously no threat to others, a situation like that would clearly be wrong. And I think most people would agree, because we can't justify it. We can't give any credible reason for it. But there, of course, are many occasions where there's some disputes and many grey areas that we'll come on to talk about. Since all life is sacred, and all people's lives especially so, we need to have a very good reason to argue if it is necessary to take our life. Because there are such consequences and repercussions, not just to the individual involved, but also to their family and the ripple effect on society at large. It's all very well having a commandment like don't be sexually immoral or don't murder in this case, but they are actually meaningless unless we properly define what we mean by those terms. When you sign and agree to any contract, it's always important that the terms of that contract are clearly defined. Otherwise, the document is meaningless. We must say, therefore, what we mean by sexually immoral, if that is the context, or in this case, what is murder. For any order or advice to have any meaning, we must be clear that it's understood. Otherwise, it's quite possible several people will all read the same thing, but actually have vastly different interpretations of it. So, how can we find a consensus? Is there one? In a way that tries to be objective and not based on our own biases, which we all naturally have. Theologically, one might say that God gives the same spiritual laws to all, if you believe that. So whatever law we apply to others, we know would also apply to ourselves. This you'd call a universal. And there's a good reason for having a universal application, because you wouldn't want to apply something that was unfair to others if it also meant that same law would be applied to yourself. So when we're applying laws equally to ourselves as to others, we're more inclined to consider our own personal feelings. And of course, those laws will be applicable to the people that we get on with, as well as those that we don't. So universal law is something that is applicable to everyone, regardless of how well we like them or not. We would not endorse unfair rules for others if it also means subscribing to that ourselves. Perhaps, and I think most people would be like that. Biologically, all humans are the same, at least in general, despite some occasional differences, perhaps such as deformations. But we all eat, we toilet, we sleep, we wake, we breathe in, we breathe out, we drink, and toileting again. We have lots of things in common biologically. And we have in general the same emotions too. Doesn't everyone want to have all of their physical, emotional and social needs met? Isn't that a desire innate to all of us? And aren't we all afraid of having our needs denied, of being left in terrible pain, disabled, demented, or abandoned? Who doesn't worry about that, since it could happen to anyone? It is because we can imagine how awful such a situation would be that we feel compelled to help others, because should that happen to us, we would also want that help equally. Conversely, we all also have the same desires, don't we? To be freed from pain, to be able to do things, to be of sane mind, to be connected to other people. We indeed have different ideas of how this is possible, yet we surely all have the same ultimate goals, because we all have the same basic needs in life. This is sufficient enough without saying why that is, in terms of finding some agreement in what is ethical. A humanist might say we have the same needs because we've developed these socially. Perhaps a pagan might say that the earth has made us this way. A theist might say that God has created us in this manner. One could even argue why or how we are where we are doesn't matter as much as what we do about it. After all, actions speak louder than thoughts or words. And as the old saying says, faith without action is like a tree that bears no fruit, the Eastern concept of Dharma. So when looking at any serious issue, we should always consider it in terms of how it affects others' well-being, our society in general, and humanity as a whole. We all have the same basic desires. We can discern how our actions will affect others through our empathy. How would I feel if I was in that person's position or in their family? With this in mind, it's worth considering different scenarios, not for some academic exercise, but because any of us might one day have to make a choice whether to act or not, and if so, how to act and what to do. I said above, there are obviously times when it's clearly right and clearly wrong to take a life. If someone is totally innocent and not an obvious threat to others, then it is clearly wrong. None of us would want ourselves or our loved ones wrongfully killed, nor even a stranger. But what if they're not totally innocent? What about perhaps in a fight, when one may be provoked or have insults or objects thrown at you? It seems clear there are many potential responses, some legitimate and others maybe not. One might think the best thing is to be defensive, to perhaps run away, lock oneself in the room, in the safe house, put distance between you and the attacker. But then what if they go on to do this to others? And if we say no response to an unprovoked attack is right, then do we not allow someone to keep on getting away with it if someone doesn't stand up? If a child is violent to their siblings with no justifiable reason, and the parents know this but fail to act, this could be considered as negligence. The child will learn he can continue bullying his siblings until he is told that it is wrong, and if he doesn't listen to his parents, he might get into trouble, for he didn't build the house that he lives in, nor earns the necessary provisions that he's dependent on. So it's necessary to hold each other to account, and we all should be held to account, but fairly. If we witness a person being assaulted along the street, say, and fail to intervene, are we not negligent in our civil duty? It is as much to say we don't believe we are a part of humanity with one goal, with one set of needs and fears, in one planet. This could be true whether you believe in one God or not. I suppose we would think if I was being attacked or assaulted in the street, would I want others to intervene if they were able to? So if a lack of response to violence, which sometimes can escalate into greater violence, is inadequate, then we must consider what is a correct response. We need judges to correctly determine someone's true motives and if they are appropriate, moral. But all of us will be called to judge in many different situations throughout our lives. I once witnessed a man wrestling a woman to the floor and restraining her while she screaming abuse at him. It seemed the right action because she was threatening someone and had grabbed a wine bottle in a split second, and the man had pounced on her, allowing her intended target to flee. He threatened to call the police on her unless she had calmed down, and he remained with her talking, so as to be sure she wouldn't later hunt the one she was angry at. In fact, oddly, once she had sobered up and wasn't so angry, she was later even glad that the man had prevented her from a possible serious assault. This, of course, could have escalated into something much worse. We need to discern according to the specific situation. Sometimes an action may appear crazy, but it may be a proper response to a crazier situation. Trying to rationalise and talk calmly to someone who's in a psychotic rage probably wouldn't have worked. An intervention there was necessary. This certainly involved risk. Supposing the woman had remained angry and had accused the man of assaulting her, she may have even had bruises or friends willing to support or believe her version of events. Supposing the broken glass was swept away and the potential target had kept quiet, too frightened to speak out. The man could have been framed as an aggressor, worse, a woman beater. The other risk is that she could have turned on him physically rather than psychologically, and he could have become the target. However, if he'd just watched the scene play out, as if he was only a passive observer, then what? What if the victim was seriously hurt? One left with possible injuries, death even could have resulted, or even psychological problems, and another with a possible criminal conviction, or at least the judgment of others and herself. Having failed to live up to the standards of decency, she might lose friends, potential jobs, but most importantly, her sense of self-worth would have been damaged. And the witness, who might have prevented this escalation of violence, would have to live with his inaction, his robotic inhumanity. So an appropriate action here led to a small heroic act, a smaller villainy, and a smaller amount of victimhood, rather than an uncaring person, a serious crime, and a serious victim. The woman in question had denied she was going to really throw the glass wine bottle, but had done it in a gesture merely to frighten the other, who had used offensive language against her. Clearly, though, her response there was disproportionate. If she was being shouted at, she doesn't have a right to inflict serious injury. If we all behaved like out of control, absolute monarchs, we would all soon be dead. Clearly, if someone is aggressive, we cannot use any force, but need to consider using a reasonable amount, in proportion, and the goal should be both to protect the aggressor and others from further harm. Supposing in this example, the woman had not seen sense, but remaining delusional, had then told numerous friends that she had been assaulted by the man, giving a censored version, omitting her own threatening gesture, thus casting the man as the villain and herself as the victim. All too tempting, because she would no doubt prefer the sympathy a genuine victim is entitled to, rather than the shame and the need to change, and the pressure perhaps to change, that she might struggle with, even if the latter is in fact the more honest way and honourable. To seek the truth, even if it appears at cost to us, for people might have judged her differently once they knew. After all, would you go for a glass of wine to her home? You might, if it was an insane one-off, out of character, and she was apologetic. Yet, if she had spread false rumours about him, and others genuinely believe this man went around assaulting women in their own home, then some of them would feel compelled to act. Even if they acted reasonably in proportion, perhaps wrestling him to the floor, giving him a taste of his own medicine, they would in fact be unknowingly assaulting an innocent man. We don't mean he's innocent in all things, just in this situation. Or, instead of wrestling him, they might have spoken sternly to him, shaming him as an abusive woman beater in his local, telling his parents, his partner, or loved ones. This could tarnish the man's reputation, and in fact, defamation of character can have serious consequences for the individual. Supposing a family member believed it, they might disown him. His manager at work might sack him, depending on the job. So, what we say to other people can have a serious consequence. He could have faced a torrent of insults from strangers down the road or on social media. Allegations, false or truthful, can invoke many responses, some reasonable, proportionate, and others perhaps not. But what if, on the false allegation of this woman and her witness, someone confronts the man reasonably, bars him from visiting their home, alienating him? This risk of confronting someone on a situation one doesn't have a first-hand knowledge of, but only a second-hand account, is why it's necessary to investigate things thoroughly and not just accept things blindly. We need to be sure how accurate information is before acting, thinking before acting. This is a difficult position because sometimes, like in this situation, inaction would be wrong. If it means a potentially violent aggressor continues unopposed, on the prowl, yet the wrong action could lead to a falsely accused person being harmed as well. So it's possible to be complicit in some sort of aggression or even murder and keep your hands clean, simply by passing on false rumours about a serious accusation which you know is wrong. Yet if you have genuine suspicions of someone, one feels compelled to investigate and act where necessary, and go wherever the evidence lies. But we should be cautious about accepting what is genuine evidence, what is planted, and what is mistaken. Often a false testimony can be very compelling. It may contain some truth mixed with lies, or even an exaggerated truth, an insult that's turned into a harassment, or a harassment that's been described as a torture, a molehill made into a mountain. So we need to be discerning before acting, remembering we're all able to lie and be lied to. We're all able to be honest and be told the truth. What if we strongly suspect someone of a serious crime or immoral conduct, but lack absolute evidence? Is it okay to hedge our bets and lock up a few innocent people? So at least we could lock up more genuine, serious abusers. Or should the benefit of the doubt prevail, which would mean protecting innocent people falsely accused, but may also allow many genuine perpetrators to portray themselves as falsely accused? Each of us must discern what we feel to be correct. Would you be willing to be locked up, or for your friends to be, if it meant some other dangerous people were too? And if the law didn't have high standards of evidence, might that not encourage a culture of spreading false testimonies? If I know everything I do or say may be used and scrutinised in a court, I might be more cautious in what I said. So I personally do believe in reasonably high standards for evidence, because I think none of us wants to be unfairly judged and sentenced. Of course, it is possible to have too high standards, where the odds of a person committing the incident are so ridiculously small that it would be too incredible. Common sense is often called for, and in serious cases it's vital to have an open, transparent trial so the potential evidence can be debated by the public in general and the jury, which is made up of the public. The purpose of prison should not be to get vengeance on someone, or we all become collectively as bad as the thing we say we're against. The two main purposes of prison are, one, to protect the public from future harm, but of course prisoners often need protecting from each other, and from guards sometimes, and equally the guards need protection from the prisoners too. So it needs to be considered why people are going to prison, and protecting the public seems to be the most important reason, in fact. But there's also other reason as well that I'll come on to. There's a logical step to prevent future abuses, and that seems to be the most important reason. Of course, there are good and bad prisons, many different kinds of prisons, in fact. We all get imprisoned sometimes, all of us, even if it's only briefly. I personally got detention at school for being late sometimes and not paying attention. Or my parents might send me to my room. I once was barred from a pub because of a verbally abusive behaviour. A prison is what restricts our freedoms, and some restrictions are sensible and may even help us grow. Many people have sobered up in a cell to regret the actions of the night before. I know I have. But there is a second reason for prison. It's not just to lock someone away and forget about them, but also to try and help people to rehabilitate, to recover from whatever ills that led to their bad action. In fact, the term penitentiary is originally derived from the term repentance. And this simply means to confess, to own up to our wrongs, and be committed to transforming ourselves so we don't continue to reoffend in the same way. Of course, there lies a great debate within this. Release a serious offender and they could go on to continue their offences. But don't, and we could just be locking up people who do feel true remorse and would never do such a thing again. It's not just the probation services that face this dilemma, of course. We all do in our life. We all face such dilemmas from time to time. Should I invite this former abusive friend to my home? His apology seems sincere, but I have no guarantee. Either way, there's a risk. Either we free people to commit more offences, or we damn them unfairly and prevent them from recovering, as they might have. It makes sense to be cautious, taking appropriate time to discern, to see what action is best, perhaps meeting that friend in a public place, for them to earn our trust, taking small calculated risks, allowing gradually more amounts of freedom, rewarding responsible behaviour with more rights. Even then, there are risks, however much we try to mitigate and minimise them. In this modern technological age, we now have a greater ability to imprison people than we did in the ancient world. In fact, some prisons are so secure and impenetrable, it would be hard to imagine anyone escaping, whereas prisons in the ancient world tended to not be so secure, hence why they were much more reliant on the death penalty, which comes with its own inherent problems. The risk of murdering an innocent person through a miscarriage of justice, or even killing someone who actually genuinely regrets his actions and wants to repair himself and pay back society, working hard to redeem himself. Of course, the death penalty or a life imprisonment, whatever you believe in, the same dilemmas and need for firm discernment remains. I tend to believe in life in prison simply because if there's a miscarriage of justice, we can release a prisoner and perhaps compensate them, even if we can't bring back the missing years. But if a man is killed, we don't have the power to bring someone back from the dead. Of course, life in prison can vary greatly. In some cases, it can be worse even than death, depending on the type of prison and one's experience. Yet equally, many people have changed their lives for the better, learned many skills, given up drugs, and found what drove them angry, and found something that helped them. There are many prisoners who don't want to engage, of course, and who may resist attempts to change for the better. But at least if we provide them the opportunity, we can say that they were treated fairly. There is the tension always between wanting to forgive others and allowing them that chance to move on from regrettable actions, and also being fearful that they may repeat offences and may lie convincingly to fool us, pretending remorse. Our actions should not be governed by anger or fear alone, but neither by mercy. Being all discipline and control without any mercy will hinder people moving on. If no one gives you a chance to change, how can you? Yet the opposite is just as wrong. The all merciful and no judgment approach, a mother's love, without any proper regulation, would allow offences to prosper and thrive potentially. When I looked in a recent poll concerning this commandment, nearly everyone agreed with it, but a few people had their doubts. And I think that was just because it properly wasn't defined, and they probably thought it's a much more complicated issue than dedicating one small sentence to it. And my few paragraphs don't even come close to it. There are a huge number of grey areas, and I think you could write volumes and volumes. And I think it warrants an entire study from each of us. And I think we all should come to our own conclusions. I've looked at some grey areas. When is it legitimate to take a life? I would probably say when you're in danger of, or when there's a danger that's in threat of someone's life, you'd have to justify it by saying you took a life to save other lives, I suppose. And I suppose that would be the only reasonable time, because that was the only course of action that you could take. If you could save other lives through any other method, you would seek to do that preferably, I suppose. But there are certainly areas where people debate about. War especially is one of those. And are there the same regulations that govern us within wars? And what is legitimate within a war and what's not? What is considered murder and what is not? And I think it's, for me, the simplest definition is when someone's life is, when they're innocent and they're no threat to anyone else, like a civilian. I would say taking a civilian's life purposefully and knowingly, I would quite happily call that murder, because they're not a threat to anybody. On the other hand, somebody that is a direct threat and that is potentially an aggressor towards you, there's the old saying, live by the sword, die by the sword, isn't there? So, but somebody who's not armed and doesn't have any weapon and is no threat to you, certainly a civilian in that position, if they are that, then of course that to me would be considered murder, regardless of the situation, regardless if it was a war. But I think people come to different considerations with these situations, and we all have to do what we think's right. There are lots of complex scenarios you could imagine. If there was a terrorist, for example, who was planted amongst a group of people, and you know, would it be wrong to take his life and the other people around him? Right? I would say totally wrong, because taking civilians' lives, it would be totally wrong, because. But then you could sort of, it depends how you sort of work the dilemma. You could say a guy with a bomb, he's, the bomb will kill 1,000 people, and there's a young child next to him, take them both out and you save 1,000 people. I mean, that would be, that's quite a ridiculous situation, but you can imagine something like that. You think, I'd still say in that scenario is wrong. But I suppose it's hard to know something unless you're doing it and you're in it. So I think it comes down to as well what your intentions are. And if your intentions are to protect others, I think that's the most important thing. And there's an old saying that mankind judges by appearance and God sees the secrets in a man's heart. So sometimes we can see each other and we can judge each other wrongly. We might sometimes think something looks like murder, when in fact it could be self-defense. And other times we might think the opposite, not always having enough evidence and knowledge of the situation to make a reasonable judgment on it. So I think it does depend. And then, of course, there's many other grey areas besides issues of war. you consider something like suicide, there's many people that would consider that to be a type of murder. Other people would say it's not, because you own your body and you have a right to end your life when you want to. And I would personally feel that it depends on the situation that you're in, and that it depends on how that affects other people. And I think if somebody was actually, I think, like going through terrible terminal illness and the pain was that awful for them, I wouldn't want to make that decision on their behalf. I would want to sort of listen to what they had to say about it, because they're the ones in that position. So I wouldn't want to sort of dictate. But I think that's true of anyone in that position. And a lot of people that have gone through suicides, they felt at the time perhaps that was their only answer, and it's quite hard to sit in judgment on someone not knowing their situation. And I suppose you'd think it would hurt the family and the people around you, and you want to consider their feelings, and you could say it's a selfish act to take your life. But then at the same time, if somebody is that psychotic and they're that suffering and they're going through an awful time, they may not be capable actually of thinking for other people. And it may be that there are some people, sadly, that don't have anyone in their lives, and actually, so it just does depend on the individual and their situation, I suppose. And there are grey areas and that we're not sure about, and I think it's a case by case thing that you decide on. And I don't think that any of us are fit to sort of judge everyone, because we lack enough knowledge, and sometimes we lack compassion when we're in a bad mood, perhaps, and we don't have the ability to know always all the right information to sort of make a proper judgment on it. And it's important to know and think about these things, because you could meet someone who had attempted suicide. You could meet the parents of someone who's died in such circumstances, and they might want to be comforted by you. They might seek your advice or something. So any of us could, and it's something that all of us will come into contact with at some point. So it's something, of course, that we should consider, and I'd encourage anyone to sort of like to look into it as an issue, and to sort of investigate what they think about it themselves. Actually, I had assumed, like with all the other commandments, that murder was just kind of a very simple thing. I understood what it was, and I sort of, as I look into it, there are very simple, clear-cut cases that are obviously wrong and terrible, and there are obviously cases that are grey areas, and there's a lot of debate, and where I still have some uncertainty